Okay, so we're going to have a look at advocacy today, and I'm going to have a look at 3 different types of advocacy that you may come across in working in social care. And I'm going to try and differentiate between the 3, because the task for you in part of the assessment is for you to be able to produce some information, either through a post or whatever format you like, to advise individuals about what advocacy is and the different types of advocacy. Okay, so if we look more generally about what advocacy is about having your voice heard, and there's many different ways of that happening, and we're not going to go into too much detail on that in this session, but I will put some stuff up on Blackboard so that you can have a look at the different ways that advocacy can happen. For some people, it is about supporting people to use their own voice and to be able to articulate themselves in meetings or in different situations, but sometimes it's about us using our voice effectively on behalf of that individual. But it's about the wishes and the views of people being genuinely considered within that process. So I'm going to go through the first slideshow, which is independent advocacy and the Care Act. So if you can follow that at the same time as the video, that would be really helpful. And then I'm going to direct you to some other resources for further research. Okay, so if we move on to the second slide, which is called Advocacy and the Law, we'll see that I've identified 3 different types of 3 different pieces of legislation. The first is the Care Act 2014, which is has a duty to provide an independent advocate if the person has substantial difficulty in understanding a process. The second one is under the Mental Health Act 2007, and it's about an independent mental health advocate, an IMHA, if detained in hospital or community treatment order, and the purpose to involve the person in decisions regarding their treatment and care. The third one is under the Mental Capacity Act 2005, and that's the appointment of an independent mental capacity advocate, an IMCA, and this is for people if they lack capacity around a specific decision. So it's really difficult, and lots of people and lots of professionals really struggle with this, getting this right, of which advocacy is right for that individual. So the challenge of today is to understand the difference between those 3, understand which legislation they're under and which one you should be using in which situation. Probably the easiest way to understand it is for an independent advocate under the Care Act, so a Care Act advocate, is for people who do have capacity. So it would be for an adult in social care who does have capacity but still has substantial difficulty in understanding a process. So somebody coming into the local authority, it is quite difficult to understand some of the processes that are going on, some of the assessments. It might be about choosing some support, it could be anything. But they have capacity and there's a way of doing it, but they still have substantial difficulty. So there's certain conditions, and we're going to look at those. But the independent advocacy under the Care Act is for people with capacity but still with substantial difficulty. The Mental Health Act is for an independent mental health advocate, an IMHA, and as it says on the slide here, it's for people who are going through that mental health system. If they're detained in hospital or have a community treatment order, it's about the involvement, somebody supporting them to make sure that they're involved in all the decisions about the treatment and care. So the IMHA is about going out and checking that that person has understood it and actually supporting them in making some choices about their own care and treatment. Finally, the Mental Capacity Advocate, the IMCA, the Independent Mental Capacity Advocate, is for people who lack decision around a specific decision. So where we have the Care Act advocate is around people who do have capacity but still have substantial difficulty. The IMCA is for people who've gone through that process of having looked at a decision, they haven't got capacity in that decision, so it may be an IMCA that we're looking at. So it's important that you understand the difference between those 3, because your job in the assessment is to relay that to other individuals. Okay, so on slide 3, I've said a little bit about the history of advocacy, which you can have a look at yourself, so I won't talk through that. So with this slide, we're going to have a look at slide 4, at the Care Act. and we're going to have a look at the two sections that relate to independent advocacy, and these are section 67 and section 68. They're very similar, and I'll try and explain some of the differences. So section 67 is for a local authority. They have a duty to consider whether they are going to need to arrange an independent advocate for somebody. And basically they're saying that in certain situations the local authority must arrange for a person who is independent of the authority to be available to represent and support the individual for the purposes of facilitating the individual's involvement, and that's section 67. Now that is for any activity. So as soon as a person comes into a local authority, it's part of that care and support journey, and it becomes apparent that they may not be understanding that process fully, or just a part of that process, then the local authority has a duty to consider whether an independent advocate is required. They may feel that it's not just about substantial difficulty, it is a lack of capacity, in which case you'd be going down the mental capacity route. But we're talking about people who might just have substantial difficulty in understanding the process. So section 68 is very similar to this, but it's around people going through a safeguarding process. So if somebody comes into the local authority through a safeguarding route, you also have to consider the need for an independent advocate. So very similar rules to the section 67, but it's just around safeguarding. So slide number 6, back to section 67. The local authority considers that were an independent advocate not to be available, the individual would experience substantial difficulty in doing one or more of the following. So that word substantial difficulty is a legal term that is given to us. It doesn't explain what it means by substantial difficulty. That is a judgment of the social worker at that stage. So if we go through to the next slide, judging substantial difficulty. So we said that had substantial difficulty in one or more of the following areas. And these areas, if you look at them, they might be very similar to something that we did last week. So I don't know if you can remember, in the Mental Capacity Act, we also looked at people having met these 4 conditions, if you like. So they are similar, which you could argue is not very helpful because it's easy to get confused about which piece of legislation we're in. Nevertheless, section 67, if a person has substantial difficulty in any of these 4 areas, then we would need to think about an advocate. So we've got understanding relevant information, retaining information, using and weighing up the information, and communicating their wishes and views. So very similar to that process that we looked at in mental capacity. So we'll go through to the next slide, and if you just pull everything up first and then I'll talk through it. Might the person have been, so somebody comes along and we're thinking, might this person have difficulty in being involved? If the answer is yes, we still have to think about whether we need to make reasonable adjustments. So it might be just the way that we're providing the information. We can't just put everybody down an independent advocate route just because they're not understanding how we're explaining it. So we still have to do all of those things. So we provide support and adjustments, and they go off, and that's fine. But if we do that, and we then have a question, do they still have substantial difficulty in being involved? If the answer is yes, we say, is there an appropriate individual? And that word appropriate individual, those words are a legal term. And it means a carer, a friend, or a relative that can facilitate their involvement. So in this sense, it may be that somebody has somebody at home who could support them through that process. And there are conditions, and we'll look at that in a minute. So if the answer is yes, then we can agree that that appropriate individual can continue and the local authority doesn't have to do anything else. If the answer is no, it is at that point that the duty is triggered. Duty under section 67 to arrange for an independent advocate. So just having a think about on the next slide about an appropriate individual to facilitate the person's involvement. We need to consider who is appropriate to support and represent a person. Is a family member or friend an appropriate individual? Well, yes, they might well be. if there is a conflict of interest, or you feel that the views, they can't support that individual through that process, then we may have to say no. But just because we may not like that individual, or we think that they're not that helpful, that does not mean that we can just say we'll get them an independent advocate. So we must be able to, the appropriate individual must be able to facilitate the individual's active involvement within that process. So that suggests that they have to be able to do that looking at the person's wishes, not their wishes. And that's where that conflict of interest, if somebody just cannot do that and is representing their own views, then we could evidence that they're not appropriate. The person who is supported must agree to the suggested appropriate individual. So we can't say to to Fred, oh, it's fine, we've got your uncle, he's going to be your appropriate individual, and he says, I hate my uncle, I don't want my uncle to do it. Oh no, it's all right, he's going to do it. We can't do that. The person has to agree. And it must not be someone who is already providing care or treatment in a professionally or paid capacity. So often people who like living in supported living might have a really good relationship with a key worker, for example, but it's not allowed to be them. So the next thing that I've done is I've given you 2 case studies to have a think about. And what I'd like you to do with the 2 case studies is to work through each of those stages of saying whether the person has substantial difficulty, in which area that might be, then consider whether they have an appropriate individual, have a look at the case studies and see who that might be, have a think about whether you think that that would be appropriate or not appropriate, and using the rules that are in the legislation, not just your own ideas about it, and have a think about whether the duty under section 67 should be triggered. So there's no right or wrong answer for these 2, and it is about professional judgment. But that's what's interesting about the law. You think that it's very specific. We've gone through a really kind of methodical set of rules, but even within that there is space for professional judgment. And that for me is where those kind of values that are embedded within social pedagogy about having understanding, comprehending and regard, thinking about Haltung, can really impact on that professional judgment that we're making. So I shall leave you with that, and then what I would like you to do is to have a look at the other videos and materials that I've put on Blackboard, because they explain the role of the IMHA and the role of the IMCA, and those are taken from some videos that are on Social Care Institute of Excellence website, which are better than I could do in terms of explaining those different types. I've also put on Blackboard a example of from Voiceability, and it's about a user-friendly guide around advocacy. I thought maybe that would give you some ideas in terms of your own assessment. So if you've got any questions on that, then you can email me. If you've got any ideas about how you might like to do your assessment and you want to check them out, that's fine too. Okay.